Hello everyone, welcome to the first video in my Advanced Guide 2 series, and we're starting off with a big topic. This might even be one of the biggest topics that I'm going to take on in this series, and that's grappling. There's been plenty of people asking for it, and I personally really love the playstyle. I've always wanted a TTRPG where I feel like grappling is actually a good combat option, and DC20 definitely pulls that off. Hopefully this video gives you a good idea on all the mechanics in the game that tie directly to grappling, to give you a good idea on how to use it. Then, at the end of the video, I'll give my thoughts and recommendations on making a strong grapple build. So, let's get to it, starting with the Grapple Action. If you take the standard Grapple Action, you use a free hand and spend 1 AP to make an athletics roll contested by the target's martial check, so they roll athletics or acrobatics. This term will come up a lot, so you better get comfortable with that. If you want the rules for contested checks, those are on page 25 of the core rules, and page 30 has the information on how to treat nat 1s and nat 20s. But mainly this is pretty intuitive. If you succeed on the check, then the target is grappled, meaning that their speed is 0 and they have disadvantage on agility saves. But this is where the fun starts for us, because there's a whole lot you can do with creatures you have grappled that we'll go over in this video. As a basic thing, you can move or drag the target you have grappled, but you can move the target to any space using your own movement, as long as you move them to some adjacent space. You can also drag the target, keeping them next to you as you move, but being slowed as you do so. This means if you want to move the target that you have and drag them, then each space you'll move will cost 2 spaces of your movement. There are quite a few ways to end grapples, which I covered a bit in my conditions video, but let me go over them quickly. The target can spend 1 AP and try and break out. They make a martial check contested by your athletics check, essentially the same checks that you use when initiating the grapple. If the target succeeds, then they break free. The grapple can also be ended if you get incapacitated, or if either you or your target gets pushed away by some forced movement effect. If such an effect is imposed on either of you, it's always you, the grappler, who makes the check or save to resist it, even if it's targeting the person to being grappled. Finally, there is another way you can get rid of the grapple, and that is if the grappled target drops. If the grappled target starts to fall, then you have to have a strong enough carry weight to be able to carry them. Unfortunately, we don't currently have carry weight rules, so this one is up to some common sense and GM judgment. Alright, so what if multiple creatures have the same target grappled? Well, in this case, the target does still count as grappled by all the grapplers, but the effect doesn't get worse. Basically, the agility save disadvantage doesn't stack or get worse. However, all the grapples are tracked separately. As long as at least one grapple exists, the target still suffers all the penalties of being grappled. Now, let's say you're trying to grapple your ally to pull them away from an enemy who has them grappled. In this case, where a grappler is trying to move the target away from another grappler who's holding onto the same target, both of you make athletic checks. So, let's say there are 5 enemies grappling your friend, and you try to drag your friend away. Then you roll athletics, and those 5 enemies roll athletics. If you beat all of their athletics, then you successfully drag your friend away. In practice, this means team grappling is really good insurance, since it means there's now multiple rolls that you need to beat, rather than just a 1v1 contested check. Alright, so there is one other way to initiate a grapple that's a bit unorthodox, and that's tackle. Basically, you have to move at least 2 spaces in a straight line, and then spend 1 AP to try and tackle a creature that's your size or smaller. You make an athletics check contested by their martial check, just like for standard grappling. If you succeed, then you grapple the target, and you both go prone. You also move 1 space in the direction you were moving in those 2 spaces before the tackle. You move an additional 1 space in that direction for each 5 you win the contest by. Tackle is very strange and likely situational action. Let me break it down a little bit. The fact that you need to move 2 spaces before and spend 1 AP to actually tackle means this really costs 2 AP total, which is more than the 1 AP you would spend to grapple normally. On top of that, you also end up prone with the target. However, the neat part about this is that since they are grappled, they can't gain the movement needed to stand up from prone, keeping them prone for as long as you maintain the grapple. You could stand up from the grapple though, but that would allow the target and any other nearby enemies to make opportunity attacks. The advantage the target gets for you being prone, and the disadvantage they get for being prone do cancel out. I could see this being a good option to finish off a last enemy, where you sort of pin them down and your party can help finish them off, using the prone to set up advantage for your team. Another time this might be useful though is essentially to take you and an ally out of danger. If an ally willingly fails the martial check, it does count as a 0 for them, which means you're likely to move quite a few additional spaces, and then both of you can likely stand up from that prone pretty safely afterwards. Tackle is a very interesting grapple alternative because that cost of going prone can be very unappealing. I'm curious to hear in the comment if any of you have other clever ideas on how to use tackle. I'm sure there's more that I haven't come up with yet. What about trying not to get grappled though? Well, for that we have dodge. Both the basic dodge and full dodge give disadvantage on attacks and grapples made against you. The only difference is that a regular dodge only applies to the first attacker grappled, but the full dodge applies to all of them until the start of your next turn. If you try a bunch of grapple techniques, don't be surprised if your enemy starts trying to dodge. Then again, if you got them to spend some of their AP defensively out of fear of your grapples, that means you're doing a good job. So, back in Tackle, I mentioned that it only works for creatures that are of your size or smaller. And generally in grapples, size matters. So if you're larger than the creature, than the creature you're trying to grapple, you have advantage on checks made to grapple or otherwise move them around. On the other hand, if you're smaller, then you have disadvantage on those checks. And finally, if you're 2 sizes smaller than your target, they will be immune to your attempts to grapple or move them. This means that for a size medium creature, you can't attempt to grapple a huge creature, but a large creature could. This means larger creatures both have an easier time grappling, but can also try to grapple targets a smaller creature just has no chance of grappling. Now, let's talk about one of my personal favorite things to do when you have a target grappled: throwing them. If you have a creature grappled, then you can try to throw them by spending 1 AP to make an athletics check against the martial check of your target. If you succeed, then the target is thrown in the direction of your choice, a distance equal to half your might, with an additional space for each 5 they fail to check by. Remember that DC20 is a rounded system, so if you have 3 might, your base throwing distance is 2. However, if the creature is smaller than you in size, you can use your full might instead of half your might to determine the throw distance. You could even choose to throw them upwards, in which case they only travel half the total distance and are subjected to an uncontrolled fall. This means that if the creature has to make a pretty difficult acrobatics check to avoid taking fall damage, as long as the fall is a height more than its agility in spaces. If you and an ally are both grappling the target as you make the attempt to throw them, then the ally has to spend 1 AP as a reaction, or could spend 1 AP as a reaction, to make an athletics check. Then their result is added to yours for the purposes of deciding if the throw is successful and how many additional spaces you can throw the target. The text here says that, finally you could choose to throw the target at another enemy. If you do so, you compare the athletics check that you had previously and compare it to the PD of the creature you want to hit. The text here says that you make an athletics check, but that is misleading since it's the same check you made before, but applied to and compared to another creature. If you hit, then the thrown creature collides with the creature you're trying to hit. Otherwise, the creature you threw just keeps going as far as they would have traveled otherwise, or until they hit a wall, tree, or a similar obstacle. Let's talk about collision damage in DC20 then. It's actually pretty straightforward. If the target collides with an immovable object, they stop in the space right before the obstacle and take bludgeoning damage equal to the amount of spaces that they couldn't travel. Having the target collide with a creature is similar, but instead of the target taking the full damage, it's split between both creatures. So for example, let's say I chuck a gnome 5 spaces towards a dragonborn that's 3 spaces away. The gnome travels 2 spaces until it collides with the dragonborn. Then those remaining 3 spaces are turned into collision damage, so each creature takes half of 3, rounded up. Both the gnome and the dragonborn are taking 2 bludgeoning damage in this situation. While the rules say it's bludgeoning damage, I could see the damage type being changed if it makes sense, like throwing an enemy into a wall of spikes could be piercing damage, but bludgeoning damage is the default. So, that's throwing, which anyone can do when grappling. But martials can also access grapple maneuvers. You need to have learned a maneuver to perform it, just like any other maneuver. The way grapple maneuvers work is that when you make a grapple attempt against a target, you can choose to add any amount of grapple maneuvers as part of the same athletics check. If you succeed, then you go through with the maneuvers. Alternatively, if you already have a target grappled, you can use any combination of grapple maneuvers as part of the same athletics check. This means you can achieve plenty of effects on a grapple without getting the multiple check penalty to accumulate. Even though the maneuvers don't mention the contested check as part of their descriptions, this rules text for the grapple maneuvers does state they all require an athletics check contested by a martial check. Just like any other maneuver, you could also spend SP instead of AP to perform these maneuvers. So let's actually go over the grapple maneuvers. First up is Body Block. Body Block is unique because it's a reaction you make in response to being targeted by an attack while you have a creature grappled. You spend 1 AP to try to share the good damage of the triggering attack with the creature you have grappled. You can also move the creature to a space adjacent to you. This can be a good way to hold the creature you're grappling hostage, and make yourself a less appealing target, assuming the enemies you're fighting don't want to avoid hurting each other at least. Then there's Restrain. You spend 1 AP and try to restrain the target you're grappling. Then the target can spend 1 AP to try to undo the restrain with no check. They do stay grappled though. This is a good move to help your allies attack the target while you have them grappled, but you should assume that they will end the restraint on themselves during their next turn, since it is so easy to do. Next up is Slam. You spend 1 AP to try and damage the creature you have grappled. You deal 1 damage by default, and 1 more damage for each 5 you succeed on the check by. We'll talk about this later when we talk about attacking with a weapon, but the benefit is that you can use Slam even if your hands are full of grappled targets. Another simple maneuver is Takedown. You spend 1 AP to try to knock the target prone. You could choose to go prone as well, but unlike Tackle, you aren't forced to. This is a really good maneuver because grappling a prone target prevents them from having the speed needed to stand up. That makes it a really powerful shutdown tool for melee combats, and unlike the Restrain maneuver, it can't be undone very easily. And the last grapple maneuver is Throw. Wait, didn't we talk about Throw earlier? Well, yes, but that was a general action that anyone can take. The Throw maneuver works very similarly. It's 1 AP to attempt to throw a target using the same rules. The rules I mentioned earlier. So you might reasonably be asking yourself, why even learn this maneuver if you can do it anyways without having to learn it? And there are a few reasons. First off, as a maneuver, it lets you spend SP instead of AP on it. But I think more importantly, it's the fact that you can use this maneuver as part of the same check you make to grapple, meaning you don't have to take the multiple check penalty involved in first grappling a target and then trying to throw them, especially if you plan to grapple them again later. If you don't plan to use throws as much when grappling, then you can ignore this maneuver and just use the throw action in niche situations where you need it. Alright, so with most of the things you can do while grappling a target covered, let's go over some ways to make your grapples better, starting with my favorite, Mantis Stance. This is one of the monk stances and is the grapple stance. You get advantage on checks to initiate, maintain, or escape grapples. The important thing to note here is that it doesn't give you advantage on the grapple maneuvers or even the basic throw action. Potentially, the bigger benefit is that if you start your turn with a creature grappled, you get 1 AP that you can use on grapple maneuvers against that target. This is pretty huge, since it lets you do even more with your turn while grappling. There is one interesting interaction about Mantis Stance I wanted to note, which is that while it gives you advantage to maintain grapples, that doesn't include advantage on checks or saves to resist being moved, meaning forced movement is sometimes an easier way to break Mantis grapples than just trying to break out the old-fashioned way. But what if you wanted the advantage to apply to all your grapple maneuvers? Well, for that, we have Rage from the Barbarian. The main benefit from Rage is that you have advantage on might checks and saves, especially the checks. This applies to all those athletic checks for grapples and throws. An interesting bonus tip here is that Rage also gives you advantage on intimidation checks, which you can use with the Intimidate skill-based action to give your enemy disadvantage on all their checks, including their martial check to resist your grapples. You could also get a bunch of other benefits from Rage, like the bonus damage on melee attacks, and being tankier because of the resistances, which does make up for the reduction in PD. In comparison to Mantis Stance, Rage provides advantage to many more kinds of checks, but Mantis Stance makes up for this by giving you an additional AP that you can use to do more grapple maneuvers. But at level 2, you could have both features, so they aren't really mutually exclusive. The other class feature that can be a big help here is skill expertise from Rogue. Although I will mention, you can achieve a similar goal by taking athletics expertise, by simply having the human skill expertise ancestry trait. Either way though, you can add an additional skill point to athletics, bringing you to a maximum of +7 if you have 3 might and adept level mastery. The interesting part about this is that while it's a bit worse than getting advantage, it does work really well paired with advantage. If you plan to grapple a lot, the key is to try to have both advantage and a high bonus to athletics. So, let's go over some ancestry traits that interact with grapples, starting with Powerful Build. This one's straightforward. You count as one size larger, even if you only take up the space of a medium creature. So, you have advantage when grappling creatures of size medium or smaller. You can even attempt to try to grapple huge creatures. There's other ancestry trait lists that can also give this, but I like Giantborn because it also has Mighty Hurl and Titanic Toss. First off, Mighty Hurl increases the distance you throw creatures by 1 space. Think of this like an additional level of success on checks to throw creatures. then Titanic Toss gives you advantage on checks made to throw creatures. These two combine really well to give you a much better use of throw as an offensive tool. A neat interaction is that I mentioned before is that Mantis Stance only applies to initiating grapples, but Titanic Toss applies to checks made to throw creatures. So you might imagine that these two don't overlap, but this is where having the throw maneuver is huge, because you can add the throw maneuver to your grapple attempt. That means the athletic check you're making is both to initiate a grapple and to throw a creature, giving you advantage from both features. Add in advantage from rage, an advantage from larger size, and you can reach advantage 4, where you roll 5 dice and keep the highest result. Hopefully now you can start to see some of the build's potential. Alright, so one more amazing Giantborn trait is Brute. It allows you to take the shove or grapple action as a minor action once per combat. This can be an incredibly strong ability, since you likely won't be using your minor actions to switch weapons or anything, essentially making this a grapple that costs no AP once per combat. Now, I have to mention what is likely my least favorite ancestry trait in the game: Secondary Arms. The reason I don't like this trait is because frankly it's too good and too cheap, and the game developers know this, so I would kind of expect this to be changed in the future, hopefully in the near future. Okay, I'll stop ranting. What does it actually do? Well, Secondary Limbs gives you 2 more arms. So remember how you need a free hand to grapple? Well, now you have 4 hands, meaning you can grapple up to 4 targets, or grapple 1 while still being able to dual wield attacks. There's a lot of options. Some of you who are familiar can try to list a bunch in the comments, but the short version is that Secondary Arms opens up a lot of flexibility for what you can do while grappling, including grappling more targets. And Secondary Arms pairs really well with Hazardous Hide. Hazardous Hide causes you to deal 1 more damage to targets you have grappled or targets grappling you. This happens at the start of their turn, and you can choose for the damage to be either corrosion, piercing, or poison when you take this trait. Now, normally this is 2 damage per round, 1 per target, but with Secondary Arms, you can bring it up to 4 damage total per round. Since the Hazardous Hide and Secondary Arms are both on the Beastborn list, it's not that hard to have both. Alright, the last trait I wanted to give a shout out to is Escape Artist from the Gnome list. This gives you advantage on checks or saves to avoid being grappled or restrained. So while you likely won't have this on your grapple build, I thought it was worth mentioning just like dodge, since it is a countermeasure to grappling. Alright, so that covers all the ways to buff grapples, so let's go over the main way to capitalize from grapples: fist weapons. Now, I see this confusion all the time, but fist weapons are not the same thing as unarmed attacks. Fist weapons are things like brass knuckles. They're actual weapons that you put on your fists and typically use to punch with. The fist weapon passive is essentially made for grappling. You deal 1 more damage to creatures that are grappled, even if they're grappled by something else. Plus, you can use the hand that you have your fist weapon in as a free hand for the purposes of initiating grapples, or maintaining them. This means dual-wielding fist weapons can be a good option to grab with one hand and punch with the other, while still being able to grab 2 targets if needed. So, before I move on to the build recommendations, I want to cover a few big ways to get creatures grappled besides what I've mentioned here. First off is capture weapons. These are complicated, so much so I might make a whole advanced guide for them, but the main idea is that the weapons with capture property don't use an attack check against the enemy's defense like other weapons, but instead you make a martial check against an enemy's physical save. If you succeeded, then they're grappled by the weapon, and if you succeeded by 10, then they're restrained by the weapon. So the important part here is that capture weapons do 1 less damage by default, but they can get heavy hits or brutal hits, meaning a success by 10 also counts as a brutal hit. It restrains the target and does 2 more damage. So, how do you get out of a capture weapon? Well, either you or the target, or an adjacent creature can spend 1 AP to make a DC10 might check and try to break the target out. Alternatively, dealing 1 damage to the capture weapon, 1 slashing damage specifically, is going to break it, which ends the grapple or restrain that it has. Force movement doesn't work here because the capture weapon is stated to move with the target, including if some force movement happens. Interestingly, this only really works on creatures from size small to large, so regardless of whatever size you are. The big thing to keep in mind for capture weapons and other alternative grapples I'm about to mention is that grapple maneuvers can't be used on them because you yourself are not the one grappling, nor do you have them grappled. It's the item in this case that's grappling the target. Another one of these alternative grapples is Druid Domain. If a creature is in your Druid Domain, then you can spend 1 AP to have the domain try to grapple them. They make a physical save against your save DC, and if they fail, they're grappled by the domain for 1 minute, or until the domain ends. It is a repeated save though, meaning they can take that save at the end of each of their turns to see if they can get out. While you have a creature grappled in your domain, you can also spend 1 AP to move them to spaces within some other part of your domain, sort of like dragging a creature that you would normally have grappled. Then we got Hunter Strike from Ranger. This lets you spend 1 SP as part of an attack to do 2 additional damage and potentially add an effect from a list. One of these options is Snare, which forces the target to make a physical save against your save DC. On a failed save, they're grappled. Now, the weird part is that the feature doesn't describe how this grapple ends or a duration. So for now, there's a bit of GM interpretation required for this. I'd probably play this as if the target was grappled by a capture weapon and allow them to break out of it in those same ways. If you're a player who plans to use this, or the GM of a player who plans to use this, you should have a discussion about how you want to implement it. Lastly, I wanted to give a shout out to Psion's Telekinetic Grapple. Now, because this is DC20 Magazine material and it's not in the core rules, I'll not be providing a screenshot, but the link to the magazine is in the description, and you can purchase it for $2.50. Instead of using your hands, you can use telekinetic abilities to grapple. Here's more or less how it works. You use spell checks instead of athletic checks for your grapples, and you count as a medium-sized creature while doing so. You can also only have a single target grappled at once. However, you can grapple a target from a distance of up to 5 spaces away, and they'll remain grappled as long as you stay within 5 spaces of them. Unlike regular grapples, you can move freely while you have the target grappled. You could drag them using the normal drag rules, so moving at only half speed. You have access to all the grapple maneuvers, but you can only use them with this telekinesis unless you learn them the official way. Most of them, though, are the same, but there are a couple with some changes. So body block, for example, requires the target to be adjacent to you, and throw will use your prime instead of the throw distance, instead of might for the throw distance. Alright, so that covers pretty much everything I wanted to talk about regarding grapples. So now let me give some recommendations on making a grapple build. First off, I'd recommend being either a barbarian or a monk. Both can do this well, but I prefer barbarian since rage is a bit more generically useful than Mantis Stance, and the berserker feature allows you to invest more heavily in might without sacrificing as much, mainly by letting you dump agility more. But monk still works perfectly fine here. Either way, by level 2 you should multi-class so you have both rage and Mantis Stance, so pick up the one you're missing. Broadly, there are 2 grapple builds I see here, the thrower and the hugger. The thrower is focused on throwing enemies, ideally at other enemies, but the hugger is made to hold on to creatures, probably using grapple maneuvers while doing so. So, with the ancestries, you should consider human for skill expertise, and then apply that to athletics. Unless you really want a lot of expertise, I think it's an easier investment to just do this than to multi-class for rogue. Then I would very highly recommend Giantborn, at least for powerful build and brute. With that being said, Beastborn also has powerful build, so you could forego Giantborn on the hugger build. The thrower build absolutely wants Giantborn though, because you get Mighty Hurl and Titanic Toss, so your throws will be far more powerful. The hugger is more interested in Beastborn traits to pick up the combination of secondary arms and Hazardous Hide. I never said you'd be a good hugger. As far as grapple maneuvers go, you should try to get all of them eventually, but I would prioritize Body Block and Takedown, since they provide unique value to both builds. The thrower build will absolutely want the throw maneuver though. For weapons, you should probably use fist weapons, and probably dual wield them. In the case of secondary arms, quad wield them, I guess. Maybe take impact and guard on them, but that's not as crucial to your grapple potential, so you can be a little bit more open there. The hugger really wants as many free hands as possible for grappling, so the fist weapons are really good for that. With the thrower build, you could even get away with a heavy shield and a fist weapon, if you really only plan to throw one creature at a time. Both builds might like to have some capture weapons as a backup, but this is less important in my opinion since you can do much less with a capture weapon than grappling someone yourself, especially for these 2 builds which really want to be the ones grappling. Alright, that wraps up everything I want to talk about with grappling. Hopefully you got a good idea of most of the grapple related things in the game and can better decide what to pick for a grapple build. There are minor details I haven't mentioned, like teleportation ending a grapple, but they're more for the person being grappled than the grappler. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Let me know what kind of advanced guides you'd like to see next, but I'm very likely to release a wild form video soon, maybe even the next video. As a bonus for watching this video to the end, I put some links in the description to Google spreadsheet calculators I made that can tell you the chance you have to succeed on a contested check, including a hardcore version of the calculator for the chance to get different levels of success. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, have the best time.